The Taliban overran Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan, on the 15th of August 2021. In the days that followed, the hardline Islamist group in its press conferences sought to give the impression that they would be more moderate than their earlier rule from 1996 to 2001, which saw the erasure of Afghan women from society. Now, the Taliban were promising protection to journalists, general amnesty to previous government workers, and respect for women's rights. Well, that wasn't to be. We've already seen the reversal of hard won rights for Afghan women and girls of the last 2 decades tragically reversed. First, girls were excluded from secondary schools. Then, last month, came the Taliban edict banning women from universities. A couple of days ago, females were barred from working in humanitarian aid. So, there's no place for Afghan women in domestic or international non governmental organizations. Women have also been banned from parks, gyms, and swimming pools. Not as widely reported is the persecution that women who were in positions of power in the last 2 decades faced. Amnesty reported that women lawyers, judges, and prosecutors were dismissed from their jobs and forced into hiding. They faced reprisals from men whom they had convicted and imprisoned for domestic and other gender based violence, who were subsequently freed from prison by the Taliban. Now, despite violent crackdowns on protesters, women have, since August 2021, come out on the streets of Kabul, Nimroz, Herat, Mazar, Sharif, among other places. This is your weekly fix. I'm Smitha Nair. Joining us on the program today is one of Afghanistan's remarkable women working tirelessly in peace building. Mariam Safi is the director of the Afghan Organization for Policy Research and Development Studies. Ms. Safi, I appreciate you making the time to talk to us about the developments unfolding in your country.
Thank you very much for having me.
Right. Straight away, in the early weeks and months following the takeover by the Taliban in August 2021, several rights activists, policymakers sounded optimistic that the Taliban would have no choice but to listen to Afghan women if they wanted to avoid economic collapse. More than a year later, the hope that economic factors would compel the Taliban to accommodate women and their rights hasn't quite borne out. We've, of course, seen economic factors that remain unchanged. Financial sanctions, asset freezes, etc., remain in place even today. Now, no country has officially recognized the Taliban government either. My question, Ms. Safi, is were you one of those hopeful that this sort of iteration of the Taliban rule would be different from 1996-2001, particularly when it came to girls' and women's education and access to jobs?
No, not really. I was actually very skeptical. And I was very skeptical because we had seen throughout the intra-Afghan dialogue how little the Taliban actually conceded when it came to talks. They hardly stepped down from their larger demands. They gave nothing in return for the concessions that they got, such as the 5,000 prisoners that were released, for instance, in addition to several other requirements at that time that they were stipulating to the Afghan negotiating team, and they were basically getting them. Not only that, but excuse me, in July of 2021, our organization has an initiative by the name of Now, and we conduct surveys across the country with women, and we gather their opinions on what's happening at the negotiation table in Doha. And the purpose of this initiative was to basically table their voices and table their demands. In July, we had asked them how the conditions had changed in the districts that had recently fallen to the Taliban. And in July, the results that we got were horrifying. We were told of instances where in those districts, schools were automatically closed. A dress code was immediately enforced. A mobility ban put in place. All those restrictions that you saw after August 2021, we were already hearing from women in July of 2021. And those surveys were very revealing. And with that in mind, when Afghanistan fell to the Taliban, I wasn't optimistic by any means. I was watching their statements very carefully. They were talking about protecting citizens. They were encouraging women to go to school, encouraging them to join the government. They had extended a general amnesty as well, and they had also said that that it was time for them to to now show that they could govern. So I was very skeptically waiting and watching the scenario on the ground, but I was very um, um, I was very skeptical as to whether they would remain committed to those promises. They were saying all the right things at that time because they wanted to show that there was a changed Taliban. But whether they would actually translate those words into action, only time would tell. And then it certainly did tell. And that is that no, they not only have they not changed, but they have become a new, sophisticated version of an oppressive regime.
Given this, how would you react to some who are making a case for engagement with the Taliban? Some who argue that America and its allies must, for the moment, set aside its demands for inclusive governance and focus instead on alleviating what are day to day concerns of the Afghan people. Would engagement at all, in your opinion, be the way to get the Taliban to reverse its position?
To be honest with you, I hear this word engagement being thrown around, especially as of late. I don't know what it means, Smitha. The international community has been engaging with the Taliban this past year. Uh, Both multilateral institutions like the United Nations, their European Union, OIC, are talking to the Taliban. There are also bilateral talks taking place. So there is no issue with talking with the Taliban. I think dialogue is quite important here to voice your I would say your red lines, or what it is that you expect from the regime in return for the support, or in return for the economic aid that you're willing to provide to the country, or the type of political engagement you want with the nation. So as members of the international community, you should be able to articulate this, and also articulate to the Taliban that those red lines are women's rights, human rights, protection of people's dignity, inclusive governance. So talking is good. However, this new way in which the term engagement is being thrown around, I think is very deceptive. So I don't know what they mean by it. As I said, they're already talking to them. If we are throwing the term engagement out to denote steps to recognition, because you think that recognition might prevent the Taliban, or might push the Taliban to reduce some of its oppressive directives that it has issued, then you've caved in, and you are now basically doing exactly what the international community had to do prior to August of 2021. That's what the Taliban did during the inter-Afghan dialogue. They stayed, they were steadfast on their demands. They were steadfast on their red lines. They did not concede. The international community got tired and said, "Okay, we're going to leave, and you and the rest of Afghanistan can deal with the situation." So I think that if we do this again, we are repeating the same mistakes. The international community must remain very, very strong on their commitments, and this is their leverage, and this is a strong leverage, but it takes time. So if we concede to them, then we are losing once again to the Taliban.
Could we, for a moment, Ms. Safi, focus on what is happening on the ground? I mean, your networks are perhaps run far deep, and you perhaps know better than most international correspondents reporting from what they are hearing on the ground in Taliban. You and other non-governmental organizations that continue to engage with people who have to survive and live their lives every day in the country. Could you take us through what the situation on the ground is, particularly for girls and women?
The situation for women and girls are are extremely difficult. They're extremely challenging. I mean, it's very difficult sometimes for me to imagine that the Afghanistan that exists now is one in which girls cannot go to school. They cannot go to university now as well. They cannot leave their homes to meet their daily needs, to go grocery shopping, for instance, to be able to work and provide for their families. These are basic, fundamental human rights, and women have been stripped of all of these in Afghanistan. So the conditions for women and girls, I recall in one of the focus groups that we were holding this past year with our women's peace circles across the country. The women mentioned to us that they said that Afghanistan was like a cage. The entire country had transformed into a cage. So they're not only caged within their homes, they're caged within the country as a whole. They feel like prisoners. And of course, from what we see on the ground, that is exactly how it is. So the situation for women and girls have become extremely difficult, and I think that it is only going to get worse. I don't see, I was not surprised when I saw the Taliban directives. I was not shocked, and I honestly don't know why members of the international community were shocked either. This was the path that we were heading towards, and when the Taliban needed to put a little extra pressure on the international community, they issued these two new directives.
Um, could you also talk about if you've got a better sense of this on whether women, we've had reports of sort of sporadic protests in Kabul and a few other cities over time, particularly in the early days of the Taliban takeover. Are women, Ms. Safi, able to mobilize in any manner, small perhaps even locally? If so, how are they doing it? And the other perhaps more pertinent question, is it even fair to expect resistance from Afghan women who are currently in the country?
I'll I would have to say that, in my opinion, it is not fair to place the burden of the resistance to a large network of what is a terrorist institution, terrorist organization, on the shoulders of Afghan women and girls. They do require support from the rest of the population, from the region, and from the international community. They alone cannot fight this fight. Now, having said that, uh, there are pockets of resistance, and there are also many scenarios, and you've even seen them very recently, where women are still taking that very, very risky step of going onto the streets and protesting for their rights, and protesting these bans that are taking place by the Taliban, and trying to explain to the regime that these are A, un-Islamic, and B, they are detrimental to the future of the country. When you imprison half of the population, you are affecting your economy. You're affecting the growth of your society. And so that's what they're articulating as they're going out, and they're protesting, and these protests are taking place. I see them in fewer numbers, but that's because over the last year, every time women have gone out and they've conducted these peaceful protests, they have been intimidated, threatened, they have been imprisoned, they have been tortured. So these actions have been taken, and it's just heightened the risk that much more. But despite that, they are still going onto the streets, and they are protesting, and they're organized in very different ways. They're in many ways very organic as well. And in other ways, these are sort of movements that came together after the fall and have continued to persist. And so they are continuing to take this risk, and they're going onto the streets. But but I will reiterate the point I made earlier. It is absolutely irresponsible of us to place this burden on the shoulders of women and girls alone. But I must say, despite that, they have taken on this burden alone.
Ms. Safi, my next question has to do with how the Taliban are perceived by the average of Afghan man, perhaps. And I ask you this because some policy analysts in the region have argued that the US-backed central government that was in place, it lacked legitimacy among the Afghan people. There was a trust deficit there for many reasons, including that it was top-heavy, it alienated other stakeholders on the local and regional level. Whereas the Taliban, over the last many years, were laying deeper roots in local communities, often providing what one analyst called better governance than what was seen, or quicker governance by many Afghans as the distant and corrupt sort of Afghan central government. So, my question is, as of today, does the Taliban enjoy wide support? Is that a fair assessment? And specifically, do the Taliban's policies vis-a-vis girls and women enjoy some support, or in the Afghan society, or at least a certain demographic?
I would say that the Taliban do not enjoy. I believe they do not enjoy wide support across the country. And the surveys that we conduct with thousands of women on a regular basis, what we see is for women continuously, despite the economic and the humanitarian crisis in the country, they continue to call for the reinstitution of their rights and their right to education and restoring their full mobility. This has been a call of Afghan women at the provincial level, not in city centers, at the provincial level throughout the past year. And we've also seen a lot of their male counterparts echoing the same thing, echoing the opening of schools, calling upon the Taliban, that highlighting that this move is absolutely un-Islamic, and it makes no sense as to why they would place these restrictions. Now, in the current situation, even in the past, we didn't have evidence to show. There was no evidence on the ground to show that the widening gap between the Afghan government, the republic, and the citizenry. So we had no evidence to suggest that this gap was causing locals to sympathize or move towards the Taliban. There is no evidence to suggest this. The only source of evidence you can cite is the Asia. We have the Asia Foundation and the reports that they used to produce annually, which was nationwide. So you can take a look at those, and they will give you the sentiment that there was no move towards the Taliban. What was happening was that the citizens were becoming disenfranchised with both the Republic and, of course, with the Taliban, who were the source and cause of the insecurity in the country, and who were also part and parcel of this widening gap between the Republic and the citizens. Now, on the Republic's end, of course, the massive corruption, the top-down approaches, the elite-centric decisions that were made, there is an array of difficulties and challenges and huge mistakes that the Republic made that also led us to August of 2021. They certainly cannot wash their hands from this. But the citizens, they're disenfranchised. And right now, I think that the citizenry, what they want is security, they want stability, and they want economic growth. They want a government in which their aspirations are represented. So if they can see the reflection in the state to be, then it's the state that they would welcome. But if you don't have that, and you're silencing your population, and you're putting more pressure on them by issuing directives that you know are going to prevent many INGOs from working in the country and providing essential services, that is going to prevent the United Nations from taking next steps to further its humanitarian efforts in the country, and at times perhaps even stop it temporarily for a certain period. So instead of doing that, you are taking steps to heighten the amount or the level of economic pressure on your citizenry. And I don't think this is lost on Afghans. So I don't accept the notion where researchers take one-off, rhetorical evidence and then generalize it and say, well, there's smooth governance by the Taliban, so the citizenry supported. No, it is swift. Their decisions are quite swift. That's true. But I have seen no quantitative evidence on the ground or any solid evidence to show either way.
Right. I want to ask you about the response of the international community, and in particular about the Muslim world. You made a reference also to how, in the sort of round of talks, it was that happened repeatedly. There was an effort made to tell the Taliban how all this is un-Islamic. Is the Muslim world, Ms. Safi, the Muslim Ummah, doing enough to stand up for the women of Afghanistan? And I just want to sort of pull up a couple of comments I've been reading online. Azita Ghanizada, the Afghan American actress, recently tweeted this. She said, one point, and she was quote tweeting a certain statement by a Taliban minister. She said 1.9 billion Muslims in the world, yet nobody is speaking out against the misinterpretation of Islam from the Taliban. Then I also remember a conversation that I had, a speech I listened to by a former Afghan MP, Nahid Farid, at a UN conference a few months ago. And she seemed to stress on the point that the OIC, that comprised 57 Muslim nations, must do more, and other countries, and create a platform, in a sense, for Afghan women to perhaps directly negotiate with the Taliban. And we've heard similar statements from Gordon Brown, who's the UN envoy for global education, also calling on the OIC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, to perhaps use its platform better to influence the Taliban. So the question is, has the Muslim world done enough?
I think that the OIC is now taking some steps that show a bit of a more harsher position, or with a harsher voice against the directives of the Taliban. And we saw this in the OIC statement after these two recent directives by the Taliban. And it was quite a strong statement. I only wish such strong statements had come before, when in August of 2021, when the OIC got together and issued a communique. In that, there is words that denote listening to Afghans and respecting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other commitments that the Afghan government or the Afghan state had made. It talks about, now the parties should sit together and bring stability and have a dialogue on the way forward. But I think that at that time, from our past experiences with the Taliban, I think that we could have used different language. We could have used language that showed that we are very serious. If you do not remain committed to these values of inclusivity and human rights, then there will be consequences. That's missing from that communique completely. In the past, OIC and the Muslim world was not harsh on the Taliban. They were also not very effective and whatever they said to the Taliban, because there was no description, or there was no instance of this is what we will do if this if you don't meet these values. There is no back and forth on that. And so the OIC in particular in Afghanistan was not a very strong institution. The OIC in Afghanistan did not play such a critical role, actually. And so after the fall, OIC all of a sudden became quite important again vis-a-vis Afghanistan. And they are producing and saying the things now that they should have said then. I hope that they continue with this tone. And to be very honest with you, I think the Taliban do not now really, they don't really respect OIC's positions anymore, and I don't think they see a reason to listen to what it is that they're saying. At the end of the day, why should they? What are the consequences? So there are no consequences. So they really don't have to. If the international community is which holds the largest humanitarian aid assistance that's going into Afghanistan, which holds the possibility of whether the Taliban will get international recognition or not, which holds their ability to gain the seat at the United Nations for Afghanistan. And if they hold all of this and the Taliban are not budging right now and are producing more stricter, directives to test the waters, well, I understand where the OIC stands a chance in ensuring that they're heard. And as I said, I frankly think, from the responses I've seen from the Taliban, that they don't really respect the OIC, and they want to be left to do what it is that they intend to do, and I don't think they'll allow the OIC to interfere in their affairs.
Okay. A final question. Years ago, and this was a pre-Taliban era, I remember watching a TED talk, I believe, of yours, where you were engaging with young Afghan women, and at some point you were talking about why it's important to be engaged with policy making, and you were encouraging young girls and women to be a part of the change they want to see. Similarly, there have been a slew of very remarkable women from Afghanistan. Many of them were ministers in the government. I remember recently listening to Muska Dastagir, a lecturer, I believe, and at the Atlantic, she was speaking at the Atlantic Council. My question is, Ms. Safi, what do you feel now? What do you feel today when there was this 2 decades of hard-won rights and progress, and you saw a certain future for your country and for the young women in it? What do you feel today when you look back? You are also sort of in exile now. You're in Toronto as you speak to us. What's going through your mind?
The devastation that myself and a lot of the women academics and activists and ministers and there's so many amazing women in Afghanistan who had fought so hard in the last 2 decades to ensure that women's rights and women's freedoms were sustainable, and that we created a stronger foundation. And when the fall happened, I was devastated, as I'm sure everybody was. And I think that devastation has continued to linger. And I don't think that devastation for me will go away until we are able to restore those rights for the citizens of Afghanistan, and particularly its women and girls. And I would say that after the fall, one of the I think it sort of started a moment of self-reflection that I feel that a lot of us went through, because the reversals of the gains of the last 20 years were so swift that it made us look into the sustainability of the foundations that we had built, or that we had thought would be sustainable. I think it really shook us to our core. And for me, it started a process of self-reflection that has not ended. because I believe that mistakes were made by the obvious parties. But then I think as civil society, as members of civil society, we also have to look internally and see where we went wrong, because those gains were not sustainable if they were able to be reversed so fast. But having said that, you can't build a nation, you can't do state building and in 20 years and say, well, in 20 years we built democratic institutions, and now these democratic institutions will be able to work on their own, and they're strong enough now, and that the institutions we created for accountability and transparency are going to hold. You cannot build a nation from the destruction that it was in 2001 to what we saw in 2021, and assume that without additional support, it would continue to remain or grow from that position. Afghanistan required a bit more attention from the international community, a bit more support from the international community, severe changes internally to be able to help basically help sustain those gains and make sure that that they don't fall the way they did or get reversed in the way they did. So there are many reasons for why we got to where we got in August of 2021. And I think that for all of us, as we went through the self-reflection, we are continuously pointing out to those mistakes, whether it was the state building, whether it was the international community, the Afghan government and the corruption, the elite-centric policies, the top-down approaches, the lack of local ownership, the structure of the civil society community as a whole. And so I would say that reflection and devastation for me personally continues to linger in my heart, and it will be there until we see a brighter day for the people of Afghanistan.
Ms. Safi, thank you for your time, your insight, and more power to the work that you do. Thank
Thank
you
you
for
so
joining
much.
us.
Thank you.